Hi, I'm James from Chaosium. I sat down with Lynne Hardy, the line editor for Rivers of London and associate editor for Call of Cthulhu, and we talked about weather in tabletop role-playing games. You don't always think of weather as a major part of every scenario, but Lynne talks here in this interview about ways you can make it really, really exciting and relevant for play. I'm going to jump across that interview in just a moment, but first, remember to subscribe to the Chaosium YouTube channel, and thanks for watching.
Weather is important in role-playing games because it can really help to set the atmosphere. It can create obstacles for the adventurers, the investigators, and it can provide interesting twists and just really ramp up the tension.
I think when people consider weather in role-playing games, they're usually thinking about throwing in a storm or a blizzard or some kind of massive and difficult event. Is that the best way to use weather? Is it always throwing a problem at your players?
Well, I mean, it's a good way of doing it. I mean, you can really go for that. I mean, let's face it, being wet is miserable. Yes, a big storm is going to cause all sorts of problems. It's going to delay you. It's going to make you cold. It's going to make you miserable. It could block the route that you're going because it could be flooded. I went on a school trip to Germany when I was, in first year of my comprehensive school. It took us 24 hours to get there because the Rhine had burst its banks and we were having to have escorts over the mountaintops and a bus full of 12-year-olds, but with the police taking us through because all the autobahns basically looked like rivers. So you can use a storm to great effect to sort of like direct players in different directions. If you're playing a game that has flying characters, a massive storm is going to cause them problems. They can't take off in that. They could get struck by lightning. They could get blown off course. But you can also use weather as sort of like omens. Let's face it. You can use rainbows as an omen. You can use sunshine breaking over, God rays from the sun coming down to point in the right direction. The fog clearing to suddenly reveal something of interest. So yes, you can do major things with it. You could have a landslide revealing something that's hidden. You could have a storm wash out hidden graves, hidden treasure, but you can also use it in a lot more subtle ways, as I mentioned before, to sort of like give atmosphere and to point people in the right direction.
I think that weather isn't necessarily something that people immediately consider when they are building their tabletop sessions. Often it comes up, or it comes up if it's a problem, like we just discussed. But if you want to learn how to use weather correctly in your games, or not correctly, but effectively in an exciting way, what kind of things should you think about as a GM?
When you're thinking about using weather as a GM, it's like, what is its purpose? It's like everything. What is it there to do? Is it there to make the story more interesting? Is it there to create problems for your players and get them to think creatively about how they solve a problem? Is it there as big dramatic background to liven things up? And if you know why you want it there, then you're going to be able to make better use of it. Although sometimes just coming up with things on the spur of the moment can really help too. Whenever I run Scratch, actually whenever I run a lot of scenarios, I always make sure I have I don't know if you can see that. I'm just going to zoom it into the camera. My little weather die that I bought many, many years ago. You see, there is a sunshine, even though it's British. Um, and at the beginning of a scenario, I will roll that just to see, because sometimes that can really help. So, at the beginning of Scratch, if I roll it and it's damp and miserable, I can evoke the typical British summer and, bedraggled tourists wandering around. But if it's bright and sunny, sometimes bright sunshine in a horror scenario is more unnerving, because should dark, horrible, spooky things be happening when the sunshine is out? Spooky, horrible things are supposed to happen in the dark and the mist. So you can really play with expectations. As I said before, it's always a case of think about what the weather's role is in your scenario and how that is going to help you tell that story.
I live in a part of the world that's very hot. In Australia, there's not a lot of blizzards. So when I play games like Beyond the Mountains of Madness, sometimes I find it difficult to understand the implications or connect with a scene that has a nature very far outside my experience. What's some ways that as a player you can clue into those moments, or as a GM that you can try and explain unusual weather patterns and things that your players might not have experienced themselves?
I suppose it's one of the ways that we can look at whether that we're not used to experiencing is we have the internet. I mean, 30 odd years ago, you were looking at BBC sound effect tapes for blowing gales and howling storms and goodness knows what, and watching Scott of the Antarctic or something about Ernest Shackleton, which still hold true. There are plenty of short video clips out there that will show you extreme weather. I suppose if you have an air conditioning unit and you're playing something in like Beyond the Mountains of Madness, as long as you've got power and you're not going to bankrupt yourself doing it, you can crank the AC up so that everybody's freezing, possibly slightly extreme. But there are plenty of resources out there. If you say ahead of time, look, we're going to be playing in an area that is this, if you want to get an idea, here's a very short video clip that you can watch to give you the sorts of ideas of the sort of kit you're going to need, the problems that it can cause, the dangers of being out in that. It was quite interesting when I moved to Toronto many, many moons ago, the fact that on the local radio they would give out bearskin will freeze in X number of minutes warnings in the middle of winter. And my eyes froze shut one day because I was walking into a wind and it was so cold, the tears crystallized in my eyelashes and they froze. I also ended up with frozen hair at one point because I didn't blow dry it in the morning. So these are things that if you're not experienced them, are weird, but thankfully we live in an age where there are resources that you can point people at and go, well, this will give you a bit of an idea.
So I'm hearing here all these excellent examples about how you can use weather to enhance the mood and the immersion of players. But I want to touch back on this adversity that can face players through storms and exciting encounters, things like that. How do you make weather a relevant and exciting thing in a game without defaulting into make another constitution check, make another survival check? How do you keep that dynamic?
One of the ways that you can look at weather in terms of how it's going to affect your dice rolls is it's not necessarily going to be constitution checks. It might be dex checks, or, I mean, the whole thing with Call of Cthulhu is that you've got the system of penalty dice. So you've got the weather. It's an external factor that is affecting everyone. So you can ask people to add a penalty die to the roll, or ask them what they're doing so that they're shooting from a safe point, they're shooting from a protected point, the wind isn't affecting them. Because obviously if you've got high winds, that's going to affect anything that you're shooting, bows, bullets, whatever. If it's raining, you're going to be slipping around on the ground. So these are all things that can be reflected, said, with a penalty die, or even with a higher level of difficulty for the roll. So like a regular success would need to become a hard success at that point. So it's ratcheting and altering the rolls that you're already asking for rather than adding additional rolls.
I think that some people, when they start to include the weather as a presence in their campaigns and start to try and put it in as a challenge for players and also put it in as something that can create mood, can fall into a trap of going too far and making every scenario filled with dark and deadly rain. Do you have any advice on how to figure out the correct balancing of how much you need to emphasize the weather in your scenarios?
How much weather to use in a scenario goes back to what we said earlier about what is the purpose of it? Why are you using it? Of course, the whole point is that you should not be using the weather to make your players miserable. You should be using the weather to make their investigators, to challenge their investigators, not to stymie them, not to prevent them getting to what they need to do, but to enrich what's going on around them. And as long as you think about that and as long as you stick with that, hopefully you won't overuse it. It's also why something like this little weather die can actually be quite useful, because if you want to include weather but you're not quite sure, at least that introduces a bit more of a random element rather than, oh, it's Tuesday, it must be raining.
So as somebody who has been making tabletop role-playing games that use weather in interesting ways for a long time, can you throw to us as players and as GMs some interesting encounters or scenes or ideas that we might not have thought of ourselves?
So, for example, I mean, this is actually one that's in Children of Fear. So, spoilers, if you're playing that, just fingers in your ears for the moment. They're walking through a section of Assam that's been badly affected. You can hear rumbles and tremors going off all around you, and that's because of the geological upheaval going on. And there's landslides. Now, landslides are very interesting consequences of weather. So, obviously, you get landslides because you've had a lot of rain. You can get landslides when you haven't had a lot of rain because the ground just becomes so dry it sort of crumbles away and just slips. You can have landslides because of mining activity and goodness knows what else. But they're very good for blocking paths, revealing hidden ways, or, the old classic of, oh, the landslide reveals the entrance to this cave, which is full of treasure kind of thing. They're good things, so you can have those rumbling on in the background, sort of foreshadowing, and the players may not be taking all that much notice, and then it becomes important. Storm clouds, you can have storm clouds on the horizon. They can be racing towards you. You can be heading into or away from the bad weather. It can be chasing you. So it's just trying to think of interesting ways of using weather in non-obvious ways.
I visited India a while ago, and I was there when the monsoon broke, and it completely illuminated a new type of weather for me. And I realized that I really didn't understand what a monsoon was, despite having maybe, an academic idea of it. Can you throw forward a couple of real world weather examples that we might not be super familiar with that we can use in our own games?
Well, this is great because over the course of my life, I have been affected by the weather in numerous weird ways. The first one I mentioned, the fact that when I went to Germany with the school when I was 12, and we went to this little village on the Rhine, we were going to do all this amazing stuff, but there were huge storms and elsewhere in Europe. And of course, it all ended up coming down the Rhine Valley, completely flooded everything. And we were escorted to the hotel by the local fire department. We were walking on duck boards because everything was underwater. The night we got there, the teachers were sandbagging the hotel with the hotel staff to keep the water out. We stood on the top of the Lorelei Rock watching rescue helicopters going down with supplies slung underneath them in nets. And at the end of the week, when the water went down, we discovered there was a bus stop over the road. There was a bus shelter, which had been completely covered by the water. So there's these knock-on effects that you might not think about. Just because it's not raining where you are, if it's raining further up a river's watershed, that is going to cause you problems. More extreme weather. The volcano, the Icelandic volcano, when that went off a few years ago, we got stranded in Toronto for a week. We couldn't get home. There were no flights. But that was half a world away. How is something extreme going off a world away going to affect your travel plans? That was really fraught. How do we get home? What's the flights? Do we have somewhere to stay? How do we afford this? All those kind of, again, it's knock-on effects of something that isn't necessarily happening in your area, that is a once in a hopefully lifetime thing with a volcano exploding. Well, depending on where you live in the world, that might happen more often than not. One of the creepiest, one of the most unnerving ones was when I worked in Salisbury, and we used to have to go to Southampton Hospital for monthly meetings, and the fog descended while we were there. And it's just little country roads to get back. So I'm driving my work colleagues in my car, not had it very long, it's a little Citroen AX. And I'm literally leaning out of the window as I'm driving, trying to work out where the white lines are on the road, because the visibility isn't even beyond the end of the bonnet, so it's how is that going to affect you finding where you are? I mean, fog is a great horror trope. It's used to great effect in the others as a barrier, but it's really alarming if you're out in it and it's happening to you. So there's all sorts of strange experiences that you can have. We were in San Francisco for our 10th wedding anniversary, and we wanted to go to Yosemite, and the weather's fine where we are now, everything seems great, but we try to get to Yosemite and things are under X number of feet of snow, and the roads have only just opened, and there's places we can't get to because they're still under X number of feet of snow. So it's always that, don't just assume that because the weather where you are is great, that the weather where you're going is also great and isn't going to cause you obstacles. So, like huge snowfalls, massive amounts of rain somewhere that's going to affect a watershed, sudden rapid fog that stops you being able to work out where you are. They're all quite frightening in their way, and can be used to great effect, but they're not necessarily happening immediately where you are. They could be where you're going.
If I wander into the dreamlands and I come across a strange place where it's raining acid or something like that, that can be a really, really exciting moment. Can you provide some insight for GMs in how they should build their own types of weather if they're exploring distant planets or going into other dimensions where weather might be different from what we experience?
Weather can be weird. Even weather on Earth can be really weird. So have a look at weird weather phenomena. Go and have a look at real world examples, and then think, well, what's the setting that I'm using it in? What's gravity like for a start? Could rain fall up? Could it go sideways? Living at the top of a hill in high wind, rain does go sideways. Um, but what factors from wherever your exotic setting, your sci-fi setting is, how is that going to affect what would happen on Earth? What, yeah, as you said, acid rain. What is different about the water system, the water cycle that could affect the rain? Um, what is different about the winds? Uh, what is different about the ice? Do they have ice? What is that ice made of? We know certain planets in the solar system, the ice is not made of water, it's frozen gas. It's highly helium, hydrogen, things like that. What's going to happen if that melts? So look at the real world to get some idea of what's going on, but then think carefully about what the actual conditions are and how that would affect the weather behavior. And if all else fails, just get really weird. If it's a science fiction setting, if it's a strange fantasy setting like the Dreamlands, let's face it, pretty much anything goes. And as long as you're consistent with it, your players will go with you on it.
You've told us a lot. Is there anything I haven't asked? Is there a final point you'd like to make or anything you'd like to reiterate?
Point I'd like to reiterate is make sure that the weather is helping sell your story. Make sure that it's providing challenges for your investigators, not stifling your players. And if you can manage those, then hopefully you'll be able to use weather to great effect in your games.